Hey guys! Part 3 of What If Naruto Graduates 2 Years Early. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start! Chapter 2, The Bell Farce. Naruto grumbled as the alarm clock got him up a little earlier than usual. He wasn't as bright-eyed and bushy-tailed as he'd normally be in the morning, since he'd spent half the night commiserating over his new assignment and questioning the mental faculties of the Hokage with Suzume. Poor Suzume had had a bit of a rough few weeks herself as well. Along with the dangers of being a shinobi, kunoichi were forced to endure men constantly staring at them and making advances, or worse because they were women. The white-haired pervert who had ruined Suzume's bath was going on his prank list. He'd know him when he ran into him, since he got a good description of him from Suzume. Right now, though, he was feeling even sorrier for himself than he was for his teammate. He'd been put on what had to have been the genin team from hell. There had been a time when he would have been over the moon at being placed on a team with Sakura, and an admittedly much shorter period of time when he would have been happy to be on a team with Sasuke. That time, however, had long since passed. Time had changed them and his views of them, and not for the better. He had once had a massive crush on the pink-haired girl named Sakura, and allowed her to hit him because that was the only physical contact he had gotten from her, and he had believed that it would be worth all of the pain and misery in the end when he and Sakura were together. In those days, he'd had a really naive view of what a boyfriend was, and after learning from his teammates who had already started navigating such relationships, he now knew that what he had actually wanted from Sakura had been to be her friend. Back then, the most he had wanted from the girl was a couple of dinner dates, and for her to hang out with him, which was pretty much the definition of friend. Admittedly, he hadn't gone about winning her over the right way, even though he did give her presents. But, as Tetsuo Sensei and Suzume had explained, her reaction to him had been both extreme and extremely abusive. And that any relationship that developed should he have managed to win her over would most likely be an unhealthy and abusive one, since there was a good chance that Sakura would have continued to abuse him out of habit even if he had become her friend. Sakura was like a rose. She was pretty to look at, but, man, did she have thorns. Sasuke was a rather thorny issue himself. At the beginning of their time at the academy, when they had still been small and he'd been in a different class, Sasuke had been a rather nice boy. He'd even played with the Uchiha a couple of times before the boy's father interfered and told him not to associate with him. Then, he changed, and not for the better. It was understandable why he changed, considering, but still. Sasuke had always been a much better student than him, and back then, that had frustrated him to no end. He had hurt and humiliated himself many times trying to prove himself the Uchiha's equal, and all he had gotten from the boy in return was cold dismissal. Even then, he still would have been willing to be the boy's friend had he but asked, but there came the day that ruined any chance of friendship whatsoever in his book. That day had been the day he had first run into Sasuke after he had graduated. The one time he had achieved something before Sasuke, the boy had ignored his accomplishment rather than acknowledge it, and, as he later learned from Irika-sensei, chose to completely deny that it had ever happened. Having either Sasuke or Sakura on the team he could have learned to deal with, but, having both, however, throwing the true genin test would be his best option. He was already a genin, so the worst that could happen to him in this case would be for him to be returned to Tetsuo Sensei with a black mark on his record. As long as he kept his nose clean, and didn't get any more of those, his career would be fine. Since he knew the actual purpose of the test, and his teammates didn't, things should turn out fine in that endeavor. Thinking about the test that was to come reminded him of the first time he had taken the final genin test. The test was over and his new sensei had told them that they'd passed. "Does anyone know what the purpose of this test was?" asked the man whom he wasn't sure whether to call Shimura-sensei or Tetsuo-sensei, since he didn't know what sort of person he was yet. He didn't know what the test could have been for other than to screw with the kids who just graduated, and from his teammates' blank looks, he could guess that they didn't know either. "Teamwork," his new sensei said when all three of them failed to answer. "Up until now, you have been tested individually, and have gotten by on your own merits. In the shinobi ranks, however, ninja are most often sent on missions in teams. To succeed, the team has to work together, and anyone who goes off on their own not only puts themselves at risk, but puts their entire team at risk as well. This test was intended to weed out those who would not be able to work together with their teammates. In this test, one's own self-interests are put at stake, making it more difficult to work as a team, especially considering the fact that you have not been ordered to do so. I told you that you had to catch me before 10, and that the last person to catch me would be the one who failed. Had you just scrabbled around individually trying to be the first, or at the very least the second to catch me, I would not have let you do so. While you could have done a better job of working together, you did so nonetheless. Uzumaki here set up a number of ingenious traps, and you Suzume-chan and Satoshi-kun worked together to corner me in them and capture me. His new sensei continued. He decided that it would be a very wise thing to say nothing at this point. If sensei said that they had worked together, they had worked together, and he wouldn't say otherwise. Because of this, you have passed, and I am proud of you all, his new sensei said. His sensei was proud of him. His sensei was proud of him. He had taken the test before when he joined Team 5, knew the purpose of the test, and Kakashi knew that he knew. If Sasuke and Sakura worked together, he would at least have to pretend to be making some small effort to pass while subtly trying to break the team apart without Kakashi noticing. But if his would-be teammates did what he thought they would do, which was what about 2/3 of the teams usually ended up doing every year, he wouldn't have to do anything more than sit back and not clue them in. Grumbling, he pulled himself out of his musings over the unwanted test and headed out the door. Even though he had a sneaking suspicion that Kakashi would be running on Kakashi Time Plus in order to rile his new recruits, and make them even more ill-tempered when the time for the test came. He set out to reach the designated meeting place near the memorial on time. Instead of taking the time to prepare breakfast, he took a granola bar with him, and a spare for later because there was no way in hell that he was going to go all morning without eating, and because he'd been run until he puked once before. And he knew it wasn't fun if you had a lot in your stomach when that happened. He wouldn't put it past Kakashi to run them until they puked as part of the test. Since he had a great deal of stamina, Kakashi would more than likely run him that much harder than the others if he did so. When he reached the meeting point, he found Sasuke and Sakura already there. Sakura looked like she hadn't slept in a week and Sasuke looked rather tired as well. Apparently, from the looks of it, they had both individually pulled an all-nighter. He'd pulled all-nighters before, and wasn't as affected by them, but he'd gotten some sleep last night, so he felt more put out than tired like his teammates were, as he was sure he'd be stuck waiting for Kakashi again. He remembered what waiting for Kakashi had been like during the week the man had taught him the Kage Bunshin. Every day that he'd had those lessons with Kakashi, he had sat there increasingly impatiently for hours on end until the man had finally arrived. The first day had been the worst. If Tetsuo-sensei hadn't warned him about the man's habits, he would have thought that his sensei had been pulling a trick on him. In fact, he had almost believed he'd been tricked by the time Kakashi had finally deigned to show up. While Tetsuo-sensei had been rather nice compared to most of the rest of the village, he hadn't liked him all that much in the beginning. Tetsuo-sensei had eventually warmed up to him as time went on though. As he watched Sasuke and Sakura yawn as they struggled to remain awake, his hands itched to set up traps all around the designated training ground, and he knew that he had at least 2 hours in which he could do so. However, he had decided not to make any effort on this no matter how much it stung his professional pride. So, instead of littering the area with a number of traps a jounin would be hard-pressed to avoid, he settled down with the books he'd brought with him. He started with a reread of Uchiha Madara's A Treatise on Traps. In the early days of Konoha, back before the Shodai Hokage had been selected, Uchiha Madara had written several books for the new ninja library, hoping to curry favor with the shinobi who were flocking to the newly forming village and be elected to the position of Hokage himself. After Senju Hashirama was selected to be the Shodai Hokage by the will of both the people of the village and the daimyo of Fire Country because he'd practically built the village's infrastructure from the ground up single-handedly, Madara had tried to take the Hokage's hat in battle. The Uchiha had not been victorious, and had died in the titanic struggle that had formed the Valley of the End, leaving behind a legacy of a mostly forgotten series of rather insightful if somewhat boring books on the ninja arts. After reading it, He was convinced that the trap book would have been the standard textbook for trap specialists if the man who'd written it hadn't fallen so far out of favor. It was brilliant, easy to understand despite being a bit boring and long-winded, and some of the traps it showed you how to make were rather ingenious if somewhat dated. Even with all of the books he'd brought with him, including Madara's traps treatise, the wait was a long and boring one. Kakashi finally showed up with 2 bento, an alarm clock, while he was in the middle of the field cooking guide, which he picked up because he really didn't want to be stuck eating only field rations when he left the village on missions, since Satoshi wasn't there to cook for him. Seeing the bento boxes, the reason the man had told them not to eat breakfast suddenly hit him. The bastard had wanted them to fight over lunch. "You're late," Sakura, who had spent the last 4 hours staring at him and whimpering again, screeched. Considering how scared of him she'd been since the day he'd snapped and told Sakura that if she tried to hit him again he'd break her arm, he was surprised that she'd even had the courage to admit disliking him yesterday, especially as vehemently as she had. In contrast, Sasuke, however, had pretended not to react to both Sakura's yell and Kakashi's lateness. The boy had some pretty good acting skills. Either that, or he was extremely good at denial, which could be a serious problem. He himself had refrained from reacting much, but that was because he'd gotten used to Kakashi's tardiness long ago, and he'd heard worse yelling around the village. "So what was it this time?" he asked before the man could give one of his stock excuses. "I know it wasn't the memorial since I can see it from here." "So what was it? Porn? You kill another expensive alarm clock and have to give it a decent burial? Or did you make those lunches yourself?" "The alarm clock, actually," Kakashi replied as he held up the shiny new alarm clock he'd brought with him. That clock was most likely going to suffer a most gruesome end on Kakashi's nightstand after it was done being used as a timer for whatever test Kakashi had planned. When it came to the more experienced ninjas, alarm clocks usually didn't last too long. After a while, certain reactions become instinctive in regards to loud noises going off practically right next to one's ear. Most ninja got around this little problem by training themselves to wake up at a certain time. When it came to some of the more stubborn ninja with a little extra disposable income, however, he understood, though. He'd actually broken the alarm clock he'd had since he was a little kid shortly after he came back from Kiri. The kunai jamming its inner workings had made it completely unsalvageable, and he'd been forced to purchase another one. Fortunately, the nightmares had faded a bit, and he hadn't broken any since then. After setting his doomed clock aside, Kakashi explained the rules of his test, which involved bells. When Kakashi had mentioned coming at him with the intent to kill, he felt a surge of some emotion he couldn't name because it seemed to be a mix of several emotions at the same time. The last time he'd gone at someone with the intent of killing them, rather than in defense of self or others, he had done so, and he'd been suffering from nightmares ever since. While he knew that Kakashi could beat him hands down if there was a fight, there was still the worry that something would happen. When the test finally started several hours later than had originally been scheduled, Sasuke and Sakura did as he had anticipated and promptly split up without a word or any covert signals or gestures indicating planning of some sort passing between the two of them as they did so. Realizing that he'd been given his out, he himself moved to the trees in order to find a location in which to kill time until the test was over. As soon as he found a sweet little hiding spot, he trapped it in case Kakashi or one of his new teammates showed up, and pulled out a book and the extra granola bar. He had learned long ago to always keep at least a little food on him so he didn't end up starving if there was an accident with the supplies. He'd also learned to keep his granola bars in a separate pocket from his emergency rations bars, as both were roughly the same shape and size. On more than one occasion, he'd accidentally handed out one of the latter when he'd intended to give one of the former, and had accidentally grabbed one of the ration bars for himself when he meant to grab one of the granola ones. Granola bars were sort of sweet, and emergency rations bars, to put it mildly, tasted like crap. Absent-mindedly opening and taking a bite of the one you didn't want while absorbed in another activity was an unpleasant experience. Eventually, after Sakura screamed indicating that Kakashi had done something that had taken her out of the running and Sasuke got his ass handed to him from the sound of it, Kakashi made his way over to him. When he noticed the man was nearby, he casually pretended to ignore the man's presence while preparing to fight if necessary. Instead of attacking him as he half expected, Kakashi just stood there and sighed. "What are you doing, Naruto?" Kakashi asked, looking up into the tree in which he was perched. "Waiting for the other two to get a clue, since the test was for their benefit," he replied. "As soon as they pull their heads out of their asses, they can easily come and find me." "Whatever," Kakashi said as he hopped into a nearby tree and pulled out his own book, clearly not impressed with Sasuke's and Sakura's performances either. By the time the alarm went off indicating that the test was over, Sasuke and Sakura, who'd been working separately, still hadn't gotten the idea of what the test was about. Sakura was tied to the post since, despite the fact he'd put absolutely no effort into passing the test, Kakashi was well aware of the fact that trying to tie him up would be a futile effort, and since Sasuke had actually made a pretty good try at getting the bells. As soon as Kakashi ordered them not to feed Sakura and vanished to a spot nearby to make sure they were following orders or whatever, he cut Sakura loose. As far as he was concerned, the test was done, everyone failed, and he could go home. As soon as the girl was free, he tossed her his lunch since he planned on seeing if Tetsuo-sensei was in the mood for barbecue, as today definitely was not an Ichiraka day, and the girl had looked and sounded as if she had been starving all morning. As soon as he started walking away, Kakashi's shoe shined in with a thunderous expression on his face and a genjutsu that showed an ominous stormy sky complete with overly dramatic flashes of lightning stretching across the scenery behind him. Apparently, the man had taken some genjutsu tips from Mato Guy, whose seaside sunset was rapidly becoming infamous. "And just where do you think you're going?" the man asked. "The test is over and he started, explaining why he was ditching his new and now former teammates. "Past," Kakashi said in an overly cheerful manner as the genjutsu dissipated, revealing the sunny autumn sky. "What?" he asked, completely surprised. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be happening. While he stood there staring at Kakashi in open-mouthed shock, Kakashi launched into an explanation of how the team had passed because he'd chucked his lunch at Sakura out of pity for the girl, and all he could think was crap. If he'd known that his act of charity would have had this result, he would have taken the lunch with him and dumped it somewhere. Near the end of the lecture, Kakashi said something he thought was particularly wise, and therefore most likely borrowed from someone else. "Those who break the rules are trash. Those who abandon their teammates are worse than trash," Kakashi had said. Considering his, Sasuke and Sakura's behavior during the test, he could already say that his new and unwanted team was currently worse than trash. The only way to go from there was up. Right. Chapter 3: Bad Day Turnaround. Tucci frowned when he saw the blonde boy coming up the street. One of his best customers, who happened to be the son of at least one of and quite possibly two of his late best customers, had abruptly stopped coming, and he wanted to know why. Especially considering the fact that the last time he'd done something like that was when he was recovering from some serious trauma. It wasn't just that Naruto's absence was putting his shinobi customers on edge for some reason, he was slightly worried for the boy, and Ayame had been rather worried about him as well. "Hey Naruto!" he called, getting the boy's attention. "Yeah, old man?" Naruto called back as he headed over to the stand. "Why haven't you been coming?" he asked. "I know it can't be missions, since Ayame seen you around the village while she was making deliveries." Naruto sat down more out of habit than anything, and began to tell him exactly why he hadn't been coming by lately. The boy's sitting down had been exactly what he'd been hoping for, since he knew from experience that once he sat down, the boy wouldn't leave without eating. Without being asked, he began preparing the noodles for the boy's first bowl. He knew from experience that if he gave the boy one free bowl, he would always eat more. If he did not eat more right then for whatever reason, then he would come back at a later date and do so. It had been a free bowl of ramen that had netted the boy as a regular customer years ago. "They put me on a different team a few weeks back," Naruto said, sounding unhappy. That was it. Though he and his daughter were civilians, his father had been a shinobi, like the vast majority of his customer base were. After spending so much time around shinobi, he understood some of the issues that came with the job that he'd decided long ago was not for him. Naruto's problem, though highly uncommon during peacetime, was unfortunately a rather common one during times of war. The academy was like an elementary school with weapons. Some kids become fond of the instructors there and made friends for life there, and some kids didn't, but the genin teams were a different issue entirely. In a properly run genin team, the bond between the genin and their jounin sensei was a rather close one, approaching that of one between a parent and a child. Genin often stayed close to their jounin sensei and their teammates long after they had advanced to chunin, or even jounin themselves, unless one or the other ended up dying. Sometimes, however, a disaster of some sort occurred, and a genin would be forced to accept a new team and call a new person sensei. When this happened, the genin in question often had a hard time adjusting to the person who, in their view, had usurped the role of sensei, and their new teammates at first. Eventually, things either got better, or the genin got transferred. But Naruto's placement with a different instructor didn't make sense. Shimura Tetsuo was an active duty jounin in good health who could easily have taken a pair of new genin from the fall class to fill out his team to replace the two who had advanced to chunin, as he had been talking about doing at the end of the summer exams. There couldn't have been a falling out between Naruto and his sensei, since he'd seen Tetsuo yesterday, and he seemed fine with Naruto if somewhat upset about something that pertained to the boy. Any reasons he could think of that would necessitate Naruto being forcibly removed from the Shimura's care would have quite likely ended with the man being in prison or executed. Since the man was alive, free, and still a jounin, none of those things could have happened. "You're not too happy with your new team, I take it," he said, hoping that Naruto would provide more information so he could solve this little puzzle that was frankly beginning to worry him a little as well. "Not really. I'll work with them because it's my duty, but," Naruto replied. "Kakashi was an okay teacher when he taught me the Kage Bunshin, but he's not Tetsuo-sensei, and he doesn't really have time for me because he's stuck fixing whatever the hell the academy did wrong with the other two. I know for a fact that whatever it wasn't Iruka-sensei's fault because he did a good job with me. I heard somewhere that Mizuki jerk who tried stealing from the Hokage had been a teaching assistant, so it was probably his doing." Now that it was done cooking, he set the bowl of Naruto's usual down in front of the boy, and the boy began to eat, continuing his story as he did so. As he listened, he found himself wondering what the heck was going on. Why would Kakashi take Naruto? By all accounts, the shinobi who had been coming here off and on since he was a little shrimp hadn't been interested in taking on any students. He'd been hearing rumors recently that the man had been given some sort of bribe to make him take a team this year, though. Had Naruto been the bribe? Why would Naruto be considered an acceptable bribe in the first place? Ever since Kakashi could barely see over the counter, the only person he'd seemed to care about was the yondaime. Well, it would seem that a certain theory of his had indeed been correct. He had speculated about it for years, ever since the Hokage had shown up with a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, chubby-cheeked toddler who bore the surname of a certain redhead that Minato had brought here on a couple of dinner dates before he became Hokage, but nothing had seemed to confirm or deny his suspicions. Until now, that was. It would seem that he was right. Naruto was the son of two of his best customers, one of whom had pissed off a shitload of people and died, leaving the boy completely unprotected. And Sakura's totally scared of me, but I guess that it was sort of my fault since I had threatened to break her arm when she tried to hit me. Naruto continued between bites. I hadn't been in a good mood that day, so I was a little harsher than usual when I decided to teach her why it wasn't a good idea to try to hit me. Noticing that Naruto's free bowl was almost finished, he began to get Naruto's second bowl ready. Things were getting back to normal now. Something just didn't seem right when he didn't see Naruto's smiling face at least a couple times a week when he wasn't on missions, and it wasn't just him who felt that way either. He had been losing several shinobi customers who had avoided his stand because something had seemed off as well. They should come back now that Naruto was back. Konohamaru sighed in relief. Since Naruto was talking now, it would be safe to approach him. Over the last few weeks, Naruto had been in an odd, grumbling bad mood which was different from his normal bad days which had been happening far less frequently lately. Today, however, when he had first seen Naruto after he had gotten off his D rank of the day, he had noticed that it had been looking to be a bad day. He could tell even before he'd seen his boss's face just by the way he was walking. However, Instead of remaining in sullen solitary silence and snapping at all who approached the way he usually did on a bad day, Naruto's mood had almost magically changed after he'd had a talk with the proprietor of Ichiraku and a couple bowls of ramen. When Naruto had settled his bill with the proprietor of Ichiraku Ramen and continued on his way, made his move. He wanted to do more than play today since he'd recently been informed that come January, he'd be attending the academy rather than being exclusively trained by Ebisu as he had been for the last couple of years. While as he'd been repeatedly informed that was a good thing, he was still very nervous. Naruto had already attended the academy, and would therefore know what to expect and be able to tell him. Naruto had taught him a great deal over the last several months, including the fact that there was no shortcut to becoming Hokage. Those who try to take what they see as the easy way to be Hokages have more often than not get hurt or killed. That had been true in the days of Senju Hashirama, and it was true now. The road to becoming Hokage was a long and hard one, and the academy was one of the steps along the way. With a cry of "Hey boss!" he rounded the corner after Naruto. Perhaps after they got all of the serious stuff out of the way, they could play ninja. He learned some of the coolest stuff while playing ninja, like the Oiroke Jutsu. Naruto had not been having a very good day. It had all started early in the morning when he decided to empty out his closet before training because it was looking a little full. After clearing out all of the trash, he started pulling out the clothing to check and see what fit and what didn't. The stuff that didn't would be going to the orphanage's charity bin, which had been where he had gotten a great deal of his clothes before the academy. Usually, he wore his clothes out before he outgrew them, but there was some stuff that had been in the back of the closet for a long time. It had been while he had been doing this cleaning that he had found the sandals buried at the back of the closet underneath an old shirt. They were much too small for him now, as his feet had grown a couple of sizes in the past year, and he couldn't have worn them again even if he had wanted to. Not that he'd ever wanted to see them again, much less wear them. The first thing he noticed about them when he finally processed what he was looking at was the fact that they still smelled faintly of old blood. His first thought had been to throw them away and forget about them, but years of conditioning had kept him from throwing away anything that could potentially be useful. He couldn't think of how they would be useful though. They didn't fit, were no good for traps, and brought back memories he would rather have stayed buried. In the end, figuring that they'd be useful for someone else, he dumped them in the orphanage pile. To make matters worse, training that day had gone abysmally as usual. The team-building exercises were little more than a farce, as neither Sasuke nor Sakura had wanted to work with him, and frankly the only reason he'd been willing to work with them was because it was his duty. Had they been out in the field, he wouldn't have left them behind, but he wasn't certain that they wouldn't leave him behind. The moniker of team was a sad joke when it came to their group. Sasuke had wanted to do everything by himself, and Sakura had gone along with Sasuke, whom she was completely obsessed over. Taijutsu training had followed the failed team-building exercise, which had even Kakashi about ready to scream in frustration. The less said about that, the better. Sasuke was good at taijutsu, nearly at Suzume's level, and therefore this team's taijutsu specialist. Taijutsu most definitely wasn't his own specialty, however. He could do the standard academy form thanks to Tetsuo sensei, but when he was forced to fight, he usually went with a style that worked for him, which Tetsuo sensei constantly lamented over, calling it a combination between the academy form and a bar brawl without the bar. Kakashi wasn't too happy with his style either, but had remarked that it seemed surprisingly effective for its purposes and would be much better if he worked on his speed. In contrast to Sasuke's excellent example of a bastardized version of the Uchiha fighting style, and his rather unorthodox style, Sakura's style was textbook perfect academy, and a rather weak example of it at that. Once again, Kakashi had been forced to attempt to begin to deal with Sakura's inadequacies, and therefore had set him and Sasuke to sparring once more. He hated sparring with Sasuke. No matter what he did, even if he won the match, Sasuke would accuse him of holding back and get upset. The thing was, he hadn't really been holding back. He performed much better in a real battle situation when he was pumped up on adrenaline and whatnot, and actually aiming to kill, but for training purposes, he wasn't holding back. He told Sasuke this many times, but the boy refused to believe him. This refusal to believe him always led to an unpleasant argument, and today was no exception. After the day's training which had left all of them in a foul mood had come a mission. Normally, those weren't too bad even though going from C-ranked missions to DS had practically felt like being demoted, but it seemed that today Kakashi had asked the missions assignment desk to pick the worst one possible in order to drive his team together through shared trauma. If that had been what Kakashi had been up to when he'd selected the mission, his plan had backfired spectacularly. However, as babysitting a spoiled 2-year-old who had only just begun potty training couldn't come close to comparing to watching comrades get killed, or coming home to discover that your entire family has been murdered by your older brother on the trauma scale. After the mission was over, he'd gone home and gathered up the orphanage charity pile he'd set aside that morning, being careful to place the sandals where he couldn't see them, and hauled it over to the orphanage. The orphanage itself brought back bad memories of a different sort. While he hadn't been abused there, he had been isolated, and had many painful memories of being alone despite the fact that he'd been surrounded by other children. He'd been about to dump the pile of clothes into the charity bin when one of the staff came over and took it from him, looking at him suspiciously the entire time. This was par for the course for one of them, however, since they had constantly blamed him for crap he hadn't done while he'd been living here, and looked about ready to accuse him of something even now. After carefully examining each article of clothing, the woman either rejected it or neatly folded it and put it in a pile. Everything would have been fine if she hadn't put the damn sandals on top of the pile, adding those memories to the unpleasant memories that he associated with this place. He didn't say anything as he left, though. It'd just make things worse if he did. He'd been on his way back home from the orphanage when old man Tucci had called out to him. He liked Tucci. The man had been nice to him, and had served him for as long as he could remember, even back before Irika had started treating him to ramen. He remembered Irika's slight surprise over the fact that he already knew the place when he had taken him here for the first time. He shouldn't have been so startled that he knew this place, considering how well known it was. Maybe it had been surprise over the fact that Tucci had served him without fuss, unlike most restaurant owners in Konoha who either kicked him out or served him last. Tucci had given him a sympathetic ear, some good advice, and a free bowl of ramen. All three of these worked towards picking his mood up significantly. His mood raised even more after he'd finished his meal and heard Konohamaru call out to him. Konohamaru was a good kid who always brightened what would have otherwise been a dull day. Chapter 4: Wave Pre-Departure. Hatake Kakashi sighed. It had been over 4.5 months since he'd gotten his team, and throughout that entire time, it had refused to bond into something resembling a cohesive whole, or at the very least, something resembling his second genin team, which had been somewhat unbalanced yet still managed to work somehow, not letting their frequent arguments get in the way of their missions. For some strange reason, it wasn't a well-known fact that he had been the only survivor of 2 teams under Minato sensei. When he was 5, he and a pair of 10-year-olds had been given to Minato sensei, who had been in his late teens at the time, to be his first genin team. 8 months after their graduation, Minato sensei had entered them in the Chunin exams to see what they were up against, and hopefully do much better next time. He and his team did well enough back then, but he had been the only one on the team to make Chunin. Before they could get another chance at a promotion, his teammates had been killed in the war on what had been supposed to be a routine mission when a well-hidden trap had gone off, catching his 2 teammates in it. For the next few years after that, it had been just him and Minato sensei. When he was 9, Minato had taken on a pair of academy graduates who were his own age in spite of his protests. They became Team 7, and they had stayed together even after the other 2 had become Chunin as well. In the end, it had taken death to separate them. First came Obito's when the other boy had died, saving his life. Then came Rin's when he couldn't see any other way out of the situation they were in, and had fully expected to join her soon. Then came Minato sensei's on that dark night when the Kyuubi had been unleashed upon the village. In the early days after Rin and Obito had been put on the team, things had been somewhat strained. He'd been the aloof one, much like Sasuke, because he'd closed himself off to just about everyone except Minato sensei after his father had died. Rin had been the one with the crush on the aloof one, much like Sakura was now, and Obito had been the one to ease the tension of difficult missions with humor that was both intentional and unintentional. Eventually, after a great deal of struggle, they had found balance, and had even become friends before it all ended. With this team, however, there wasn't even the precarious balance his Team 7 had had in the beginning when he had viewed Obito and Rin as a pair of interlopers who were taking Minato-sensei's attention away from him. While his students could now perform the team formations flawlessly, and complete group tasks when ordered to do so, there was something completely missing, and he knew exactly what it was. There was no laughter, no joy, not even a vague sense of camaraderie, earned through shared trials or otherwise. While there was a Kakashi and a Rin, there was no Obito to brighten the day and make them stop taking themselves so seriously. In fact, the teammate most likely to have been the one to provide good cheer had been in a foul and surly mood for several months, and was starting to show signs of extreme restlessness. He could understand Naruto's restlessness, as he was feeling it too. He hadn't been this inactive in a long time, and hadn't stayed within the boundaries of Konoha for this long in years, and the last time he'd done so had been because he'd been dragged back to the village mostly dead, and had needed a long time to recuperate. With Naruto going completely stir-crazy, odds were that there would be no meaningful progress anytime soon. Perhaps, what the entire team needed was to get away from it all. A change of scenery would do them some good, and give them a chance at a fresh start. In peacetime, AC rank was practically a paid vacation, and a vacation was exactly what this team needed. Naruto had taken C ranks before, so there was a good chance that the Hokage would allow his team to take one now, despite how recently 2 of his students had graduated, as there was usually at least a 6-month wait before C ranks were handed out to rookie teams. With his mind made up, he resolved to request a C rank after the team's current mission ended. Now to catch that stupid cat. Why had he signed the team up for this one? Oh yeah, shared trauma, which was rather pointless since both Sasuke and Naruto had experienced worse, much, much worse. He winced as a particularly nasty swear word came in over his radio headset. Great. The perpetual argument between Sasuke and Naruto had already started, and it wasn't the nice friendly kind between rivals like the ones he and Obito used to have. How the hell they managed to successfully complete missions while tearing at each other's throats, he didn't know. Naruto stared at Kakashi in barely restrained shock as the man requested a C rank mission. While the opportunity to get out of the village was appreciated since he'd been feeling boxed in for a while, he had to wonder what the man had been thinking. Tetsuo-sensei had waited almost a year before requesting a C rank for his old team because he'd wanted to make sure that the team could work almost seamlessly as a whole before he took them outside the village and into potential danger. What happened in River Country was another story entirely. But the dynamic on this team, to put it mildly, sucked. However, they were worse than a team that consisted of members of clans that were going through a 3-way feud. If there was some sort of incident, there was a good chance that all of the cooperative team training that they had done would go flying out the window. Based on his attitude and past behavior, Sasuke would more than likely race into the fray and face it head-on without pausing to consider the danger or even a possible plan, while Sakura screamed for him to save her. And he'd probably be forced to rescue them both, if Kakashi wasn't forced to rescue all 3 of them, that is. Fortunately, things didn't usually go wrong on C ranks during peacetime, and they usually ended up being more of an advanced training trip for Genin, the equivalent of D ranks for Chunin, and something like a milk run for Jounin. Unfortunately for him and his team, however, the Chunin always got first pick and took all of the better missions, leaving the more than slightly sucky ones to the more experienced Genin teams who came in to get what was left over. As a general rule of thumb, Jounin escorted princesses, Chunin escorted merchants, and Genin escorted brats. For some reason that probably had to do with the fact that the tobacco in his pipe didn't exactly smell like tobacco, the Hokage complied with Kakashi's request, and he was now stuck on a last pick of the day mission, which he just knew was going to royally suck since both all of the Chunin and the other Genin teams who dropped by earlier had already rejected it. Great. Things just kept getting better and better. Well, there was one high point of the mission, and that was that he'd be able to get a chance to see where his mother was born, or rather the ruins of the village in which his mother had been born. Wave had once been Whirlpool before it had been reorganized following the invasion during the Second War, and what was left of Yuzushiogakure was somewhere in that tiny country. He hadn't really been expecting much when it came to the person that his team was going to escort, and even those lowered expectations hadn't been met. When the old man walked in and started insulting everybody, he just knew that he was going to be that kind of drunk. Ninja often got stuck with two kinds of drunk: 1. The overly friendly kind of drunk that was a constant annoyance, and 2. The less than friendly kind that was a constant test of one's self-control. As they say, however, the customer is always right, and if you go killing the customers for pissing you off, they'll start taking their money elsewhere, and you'll start starving because you'll be out of business. After being put on a last pick of the day mission and meeting his drunken client, it was only natural that he'd been in a decidedly homicidal mood when he went home to pack. If it hadn't been for Suzum teaching him how to make storage seals, choosing what to bring with him would have been a much more difficult decision. Aside from his storage seals and explosive tags, he was pretty much hopeless at seals. Sure, he could recognize them for what they were, and make an educated guess at their purpose, but making them himself was almost completely beyond him. It had been through sheer repetition that he had become as proficient at the seals he was good at making as he was. Once he was done packing and hiding his valuables in case Satoshi dropped by while he was away, he left his apartment key, rooftop greenhouse key, and the list of trap locations with Suzum so she could tend to his plants while he was gone. The reason he'd chosen Suzum was because he was reasonably certain that with her, he would come back to find everything where he left it. With Satoshi, he'd be spending his mission pay getting his more important belongings out of Hawk, as the boy still hadn't learned his lesson and had to be a gambling-addicted kleptomaniac or something. With Tetsuo-sensei, he'd probably come home to find that the man had taken the opportunity to retaliate for one of his more good-natured pranks. He'd been stuck with purple hair for a week after the last time Tetsuo-sensei had gotten back at him for a prank. Sasuke growled as he packed for his mission, not in the least bit happy with the situation. Since they would be leaving bright and early the next morning, he wouldn't have time to do it then. He was going on his first C-ranked mission, and, while that would normally be considered a good thing as it was a sign that he was moving up in the world if only very slightly, he was only going because Kakashi thought that he was bored. Contrary to the way things should be, he wasn't taking a more difficult mission on the basis of his own merit but because Kakashi had wanted to please that boy. He had worked hard for years, trained for endless hours, studied for days on end, and in under an hour, that boy came along and made a mockery of everything he'd worked for, and showed him how little he had gained through his efforts. What was worse was that that boy constantly refused to give him his all so he could grow stronger, surpass him, and prove his superiority. Despite all of his attempts to get him to do otherwise, that boy refused to take him seriously, treating him like he was something to play with to fill the empty hours while he was held back. To add insult to injury, every time that boy held back against him, he would make some stupid excuse for why he hadn't taken him seriously, just like he used to do back at the academy. Since they were usually about him when he was in the vicinity, and often brought up things he didn't want to think about, he usually ignored the whispers around town. But sometime around January, he'd heard the same thing being whispered over and over by the shinobi he'd passed, something that, rather than being about him as usual, was about that boy. For several weeks, he had heard constant repetitions of why isn't he in the Chunin exams. And ever since the Chunin exams had completely passed until July, he'd been hearing he should be a Chunin already. This, of course, was all Kakashi's fault. The whispers, the fact that that boy was playing with him, the insults to his pride, everything. For whatever reason, Kakashi was holding that boy back, and he was stuck paying for it. Sakura brushed her hair before bed. She was exceedingly nervous about the mission that was ahead of her. While it wouldn't be her first time outside of Konoha, it would be her first time as a ninja, and her first time in a foreign country, and she'd be going there with Naruto. While they were gone, there would only be Sasuke and Kakashi there to save her should Naruto finally snap like he had been looking like he was about to do for months. Naruto had apologized for the threat he made shortly after they became teammates, and told her that he would never harm his comrades, but still, the fear was there. She had read the statistics on shinobi who had suffered a break in the field and attacked everyone around them instead of just the enemy. Being a ninja was a high-risk, an extremely stressful job which came with a burnout rate that was much higher than in just about every other career field. The number of psychotic breaks suffered by shinobi were proportionately higher as well. Over the last few months she had also read up on ways to detect the signs that a shinobi was under an unusually high amount of pressure, and therefore at risk of suffering a psychotic break. Naruto was displaying several of these signs, and had been displaying them for as long as he'd been on the team. While snappishness by itself was considered a minor character flaw, snappishness combined with extreme irritability and restlessness were warning signs of something even more serious. Naruto may have promised never to harm her or any of his other comrades, but that was no guarantee. He had snapped before, and he could do it again at any time, and she could quite easily be one of the casualties due to proximity. After she finished brushing her hair, she checked her pack once more. She had packed it according to the academy guide, so it should be fine, but it was something to do to keep her mind off other things. After she finished checking her pack, she climbed under the covers of her bed and hoped she would get at least some sleep before she was due to leave for her first C-ranked mission. Tazuna gulped down his drink, hoping to drown out the overwhelming feeling of guilt he was currently experiencing. While he had never been a shinobi, his Uzumaki cousin on his mother's side had been, and he had learned some things from the older boy before he had died on a mission. One of the things he'd learned that had stuck with him over the years was how missions were handed out. When he'd fudged a mission ranking on his request, he had fully expected to get a team of Chunin. C ranks were usually reserved for Chunin, and only after the Chunin had made their pick were any remaining C ranks given to the more experienced Genin teams. Instead of being given a team of Chunin who might have been able to deal with Gado's mercenaries in a pinch, he'd been given a Genin team that looked as if it had just graduated from the academy. While a Genin team had a Jounin on it, which would normally be a plus since Jounin were rumored to be worth 10 Chunin, the man would be handicapped by his need to protect his Genin, and wouldn't nearly be as effective as he would otherwise have been. This was especially bad in this situation because the unsuspecting team would be walking into a great deal more danger than they signed up for. It was too late to turn back now, however. What was done was done. If he went back and admitted his lie, he and his people would not get the help they needed, and there was a possibility that he would become a guest of the torture and interrogations department, as shinobi villages didn't take too kindly to people deliberately misranking their missions, and tended to become suspicious of their motives for doing so. He had come to Konoha because they had once been an ally, and, in hindsight, that had made his betrayal only that much worse. So, he drank to forget the guilt of his actions as well as the worry over what would happen to his family and friends if help didn't come. Chapter 5, Wave, Shinobi Sign Language. The team had been several hours out when the first bit of trouble began. When the fighting started, Sasuke had raced headlong into danger without a plan after Kakashi had Kawarimi'd out just as Naruto had expected he would, and Sakura held back too frightened to scream. As he'd half expected he would have to, Naruto had been forced to come up with a plan on the fly to deal with this. Eventually, he and Sasuke, who had been pretty much acting on his own while he compensated, had brought the two renegade Chunin down, and Kakashi had learned who their target was. When Kakashi had confronted Tazuna about his deception regarding the mission's actual difficulty, Tazuna had informed him that Wave had been virtually taken over by a shipping magnate who had bought up all of the ports, and that he was a threat to the man's rule because he'd been building a bridge to the mainland that he had refused to sell. The shipping magnate, whose name was Gado, had arranged to have him killed in hopes of forcing his heirs to sell his shares in a bridge that he actually pretty much owned in name alone, as he had contractually promised all of the shares to the workers after the completion of the bridge in exchange for their work, as he had only been able to pay them very little in the way of wages. Honestly, thanks to the incident with the demon brothers, Naruto's first instinct upon hearing this had been to turn back, but he knew that he couldn't turn his back on his mother's former homeland and say, well, the mission's beyond my pay grade, so bye. While he had been with Tetsuo Sensei, the man had made him read the newspaper every morning in order to improve his reading skills and make him get into the habit of keeping himself up to date on current events, which he had previously been almost completely oblivious to. While reading the paper, he had occasionally come across stories about stalled investigations into Gado's businesses, including a recent article about a minor port town in the land of tea that the man had recently bought outright. While reading these stories, he had read between the lines as Tetsuo Sensei had taught him to, and he had come to the conclusion that the man was a complete jerk who destroyed every place in which he set up business. Apparently, his mother's former homeland was next on the list. So, When Kakashi actually took a vote rather than unilaterally deciding on their course of action as a jounin in charge of a team of genin was supposed to do, he found himself voting to continue onward. Even if it hadn't been his mother's homeland, he would have wanted to do something about what was going on there. If people like Gato were allowed to go unchecked, they ended up causing trouble in one's own backyard rather than the neighbors, and Wave was pretty damn close to Fire Country. Close enough to build a bridge to, in fact. He would have to start planning how he would be dealing with what lay in wait for him and his team on the road ahead soon. He was best at planning on the fly, but he wasn't too bad at long-range planning either. Tetsuo-sensei had taught him how to use his skill in planning pranks to plan battles beforehand, and that had helped him greatly in the past when dealing with bandits. While no plan survived contact with the enemy, the general shape of the plan usually did. And if he had a general idea where his teammates would be ahead of time, he would have a general idea as to where on the battlefield to set up traps on the fly if he got the opportunity. It wouldn't do to catch your teammates in traps meant for the enemy after all. The kind of battle where he would have to fight his way through completely capable opponents because he hadn't been able to set any traps up beforehand was his least favorite kind of fight. Beggars can't be choosers, and it was going to be the sort of fight he and his team were going to be engaged in when the next ninja came after Tazuna's head, however. He had been right back at the mission assignment desk. This mission was going to suck royally. Even though it was well out of his way, Haku had made it a point to pass by this place whenever he was in Wave. Zabuza had shown it to him years ago, when they had passed through the small island country on the way to the mainland when they had fled from Kiri after the failed coup. To Zabuza, this place had been a reminder of how greatness could fall with few to mark its passing. To him, though, this place had held a haunting and melancholy beauty that had spoken of how quickly things could end when you least expect them to. Though some household goods still remained moldering in homes that had not been lived in decades, time and rain had washed away all of the blood and most of the memories of this place. And now, pretty much all that was left to mark the existence of the once proud Yuzushiyobikyo was a series of partially cannibalized ruins that stretched down to the sea. He could not stay here long this time, however, because their target was due to arrive in Wave soon, and he and Zabuza were going to intercept him before he reached his home. Despite their employer's suggestions, they would not be attacking the target's family unless it became absolutely necessary to do so. 1. It had not been included in their contract, and 2. As well as being wrong for several reasons, it was also the sort of action that would breed ill will amongst the locals, which would in turn make them more willing to cooperate with any hunter nin who might have picked up their trail. As long as he and Zabuza left the locals alone, the locals would pretty much ignore their presence. That was the usual arrangement that people outside of the hidden villages tended to have with missing nin unless the nuke nin in question went and started making trouble. There were more than enough problems in life without attracting attention to oneself by turning someone who was probably only rogue due to some political issue over to the authorities. If they weren't hurting anybody, it usually wasn't worth the trouble. Staring at the ruins again? Zabuza asked, when he finally rejoined him. I was Zabuza-sama, he replied as he picked up his mask and equipment pouch and prepared to depart. I honestly don't know what you see in them, Zabuza muttered as he checked his own equipment. Not that there was much of it, because times had gotten a little tough lately, and it was rather difficult to find a reasonably priced supplier who would sell to missing nin without turning them in. As soon as they were ready to go, they headed to the pre-selected ambush point and settled down for what could be a long wait. Most of the time on these types of missions, there was a lot of hurry up and wait, as targets had sometimes passed by ninja who had based the timing of their ambush on their target's ETA and delayed arriving accordingly, only to find that the target in question had already passed through the pre-selected zone. Therefore, it was always prudent to arrive early to an ambush in case the target arrived earlier than expected. While he waited for the target to show, he killed some time by feeding Yuki, who was feeling restless at being cooped up in a tiny cage rather than in the small pen he'd built for the rabbit when they had arrived in Wave a couple weeks back. When the time came, Yuki would be released for Zabuza-sama to switch with if necessary. Until then, the rabbit was both his pet and his responsibility. Kakashi sighed as he watched his team, who were bickering once more as they trailed behind him. Naruto had attempted to hold a silent conversation with his teammates, and became frustrated when they didn't understand, or rather when Sakura hadn't understood and Sasuke had refused to respond. Over the decades, shinobi hand signs had evolved into a separate language that was practically every ninja's second language. As well as the universal shinobi language that was most frequently used on joint missions, each village had its own language that had developed from their standard hand signs, and just about every clan had created its own dialect. When a civilian born or raised shinobi learned the language both universal and local from their teammates, they usually picked up inflections and sign variations from the dominant clan on the team. The dominant clan on Naruto's team, which was more of a family actually, had been the Shimura, which made Naruto's distinct Uchiha accent all the more puzzling. Rather than attempting to chat without the sensei overhearing as most genin tried to do at some point during their careers, Naruto had been trying to relay a slightly complicated battle plan that had involved team positions to the rest of the team. As far as he was concerned, Naruto had been perfectly intelligible despite his use of several unconventional signs, including a few slightly vulgar ones which were almost exclusively used by one of Konoha's street gangs. Sakura had not understood him at all, however, and, after initially giving him a briefly puzzled look, Sasuke had refused to respond when Naruto had asked him a couple questions about his preferred range of combat in order to refine his plan. After failing to receive the response he'd expected, Naruto had snapped at the other two, which had led to an argument, which had somehow led to Naruto finally losing his last shred of patience with Sakura and loudly listing what were in his opinion every last one of Sakura's failings. Which had led to a vicious row between the two of them that had eventually de-escalated to the usual bickering, except that Sakura was now in the mix rather than silently hanging back and occasionally chiming in her support for Sasuke like she usually did. If this continued, he might have to let Sasuke and Sakura go. He may be the only person in the village who could teach Sasuke how to use his Sharingan if or when it finally manifested, but he didn't really have to be the boy's teacher full-time to do so. More than enough Jounin and Tokubetsu Jounin had made apprenticeship offers for the boy, so it wasn't like the Uchiha would go without being trained in everything else. Sasuke seemed to do better with one-on-one training anyway. He also knew a pretty good by-the-book Tokubetsu Jounin who might like to have Sakura, since he now had some free time on his hands because his student was attending the academy. The girl could be trained to be a private tutor or an academy instructor, since she seemed to know all of the books by heart, and seemed to take great pleasure in imparting that knowledge. As he walked in formation with his team, Sasuke watched Kakashi and that boy communicate. The argument they'd been engaged in earlier had turned to cold silence after that boy and Sakura finished snipping at each other after that boy criticized Sakura's textbook perfect performance in everything she did, and told her that she was quite likely going to get herself killed by a ninja who had bought the academy texts off the black market if she continued to religiously adhere to the academy curriculum rather than develop her own style. Now, Kakashi and that boy were holding a conversation completely in hand signs. While this normally wouldn't be of interest to him, he had noticed that the two of them were using a number of signs that had been exclusively used internally within his clan throughout the conversation. "Where did you learn?" He finally signed to the two when his curiosity had gotten the best of him. He could tell that he was seriously rusty, but then again, he hadn't been able to communicate this way with anyone in years. Kakashi replied with what was obviously a personal call sign, since the man couldn't possibly have learned the Uchiha signs from a piece of eyewear. He wasn't familiar with that call sign, however, but then again, he hadn't known the call signs of everyone in the clan. That boy signed back, "Older boy show once. Watch people's hands, watch police, so you know when to run." He'd learned the Uchiha signs just by watching? And now that he thought about it, what the hell had he been running from the police for? "Why you not answer earlier?" That boy signed, still upset at his prior lack of response. The reason he hadn't answered that boy earlier had been out of embarrassment, not that he'd ever tell him. He hadn't communicated this way for years, and hadn't been all that fluent, as he'd only been learning for about a year or so when he stopped. Naturally, he'd forgotten a number of the signs over the years since he'd had no one to talk to since he was 8, and hadn't needed anything more than the standard signs that were taught in the academy since then. As if just to show how much better he was, that boy had of course revealed that he was extremely fluent, and had an idiomatic grasp of the language. When he'd realized he'd only partially understood what that boy had been saying, and that he'd forgotten the sign for close to mid-range, he had decided to remain silent, rather than reveal his ignorance. He would of course continue to remain silent on that matter, as revealing his ignorance would only cause him even greater embarrassment now. Sakura watched Sasuke, Kakashi and Naruto communicate and felt a little jealous over the fact that she was being left out once more. When Naruto had tried to communicate with her earlier, it had taken her a full minute to even realize that that had been what he was doing. It had been the attack, defend, and location signs that she'd learned at the academy that had finally clued her in. Ino Pig had started to teach her some sort of language that involved the academy hand signs years ago, but she had quit when they had decided to become rivals. She still remembered some signs like flower and tree though, none of which Naruto had used. After a while, Sasuke stopped communicating, and nothing Naruto did would get him signing again. Eventually, Naruto gave up. After Naruto gave up on Sasuke, Kakashi started a private conversation with Naruto, and she understood absolutely none of it. After a long period of silent communication, Kakashi looked back at her and started signing something. Naruto looked upset and signed something back. Kakashi replied by repeating what he'd signed earlier. Looking rather put upon, Naruto turned and walked back to her, muttering under his breath the entire time. "What signs do you know?" Naruto snapped when he reached her. She went through all of the academy signs, starting with the 12 basic hand seals used in jutsu and continuing through the ones meant to alert someone to the presence of the enemy or convey the most basic elements for a plan of attack, namely, a set of numbers, a distance indicator, centimeters, meters, kilometers, the cardinal directions. Over there, wait for time interval of X, hours, minutes, seconds at X time, hide, defend, retreat, and attack. Crap. Naruto moaned. I've really got my work cut out for me. Did Naruto mean what she thought he meant? Naruto looked around, but still seemed hesitant for some reason. Kakashi signed an affirmative, and he relaxed slightly. Okay, here are the basic kana, Naruto said as he began a series of 48 signs. Chapter 6, Wave, Club Pins and Fights. Sasuke had been completely amazed by the sight of the incomplete bridge that would soon connect Wave to the mainland and therefore had had a hard time hiding his reaction to that amazement. He succeeded, however, if only just. A good shinobi never showed his emotions, and he was determined to be an even better shinobi than that man had been. Upon first catching sight of the bridge, Sakura had gasped in amazement and quietly complimented Tazuna. That boy, however. Damn it! Why didn't I think of that earlier? That boy grumbled before digging in his pack and pulling out a shirt that was a shade of orange that was almost brown. Sasuke, take that shirt off, that boy said. Why? He asked. Other than the old saying, if you see a fan, go for the eyes? That boy replied. I don't want the enemy to know that there's another prize on the team, which will happen if you drop that pack of yours. You're still small enough to be portable, and almost of breeding age, which means you'll fetch a good price on the black market. Tetsuo Sensei nearly got himself killed last year recovering a girl from one of the lesser clans, and we don't need a problem like that on top of all the problems this mission already has. Seeing that his teammate's logic was sound in this instance, he quickly pulled his shirt off and accepted the orange one that boy had offered, even though it wasn't his favorite color. He'd heard the horror stories when he was little, and they'd given him nightmares. Back before the massacre, his elder cousins had delighted in telling him stories of Uchiha being blinded in battle, and of Uchiha children being stolen in the night. Despite the fact that he didn't have a clan to protect him and retrieve him should he be taken anymore, he had not even once considered the possibility of either happening to him while on this mission. That boy who had never had a clan or a bloodline, and had never faced the possibility of such things happening to him, and therefore should be mostly unaware of the risk, obviously had, however. As he carefully folded his shirt, making sure the Uchiha clan symbol was both on the outside and unfolded, and put it in his pack, that boy held his hand out to Sakura expectantly. What? Sakura finally asked when that boy made an impatient gimme gesture. Fan club pin, that boy said, as he made the Uchiha clan general call sign, obviously still trying to teach Sakura the language, though why he had made that sign instead of the sign for pin, he didn't know. The girl rather reluctantly pulled something out of one of the hidden pockets on her dress and handed it to that boy, looking very unhappy to be doing so. Where the hell did you get this? This thing is a collector's item, that boy said as he turned the object over in his hands. My grandmother's stuff. Mom let me have it after she died, the girl said in a mumble, looking slightly embarrassed. What is it? He asked. One of the original Uchiha Izuna fan club pins from back before the founding. You can tell by the craftsmanship that indicates that it comes from the land of iron rather than Konoha and the odd marking on the back. The ones for the Madara fan club had a different marking, and the ones for your fan club are Konoha made, of a cheaper metal, and don't have a marking. I started collecting the damn things after I got a Madara pin from Tetsuo sensei for my 11th birthday along with a copy of his trap book. I have no idea where he got it though, because the people who kept them all these years generally aren't willing to part with them since they're practically family heirlooms at this point, that boy said as he handed it to him. It'll be far less obvious than that giant fan on your back, but still allow you to hold to the tradition of wearing your clan standard into battle. Pin it to your collar. How do you know about that tradition? He asked as he complied, a little dubiously, considering the origins of the pin. You are currently wearing the Uzumaki spiral, Naruto said as he pointed to a design that was of a blood-red shinobi spiral that looked to be set into a target of some sort that was on the right sleeve of the shirt he was wearing. You do realize, Naruto, that by allowing Sasuke to wear your clan symbol, you've adopted him into your clan, don't you? Kakashi called over lazily from the back of the boat. I what? That boy yelled. Momochi Zabuza resisted the urge to shift impatiently. After hours and hours of waiting, his target was very slowly in his opinion coming up the road with his escort. He counted 3 genin and a very familiar-looking silver-haired jounin. As he looked over the team that was approaching, he assessed his opponents. He would have to watch out for the pink-haired one, as unusual hair colors were almost always a sign of a Kekkai Genkai of some sort. He might have to watch out for the blonde one as well, considering the facial markings that looked to have been tattooed onto his cheeks, since such tattoos on kids that age were a sign of them belonging to a ninja clan. The black-haired one was of least concern. As he was sizing up his opponents, the blonde-haired one started sniffing the air, and turned slightly in his direction. The boy hadn't been obvious about it, but he'd seen that method of tracking often enough to recognize it. He'd encountered members of a tattooed ninja clan in Konoha whose behavior matched that of the boy a number of times before, and had barely escaped with his life each time he'd done so. The boy was obviously an Inuzuka, though why he didn't have a dog with him, perhaps it was ill and had to be left at home. As he watched, the blonde Inuzuka's hand moved toward the kunai pouch that had been strapped to his leg. He'd been made. He quickly switched places with Haku's rabbit an instant before the kunai went sailing through the spot he'd previously occupied. The team went to investigate immediately afterward, and only found the distraction. Naruto, why did you attack that poor defenseless rabbit? The pink-haired girl asked, sounding horrified. It smells like people, the unfortunately named Inuzuka replied. Knowing that he'd lost the advantage of surprise, he prepared to make his attack. Despite the natures of the man's students, his main opponent would be Sharingan Kakashi the copy ninja. In a battle such as the upcoming one, the genin would be little more than a distraction. Fortunately for him, the genin would be a distraction to the Hatake as well, a distraction he'd be forced to protect, tipping the balance in his favor. It was time for him to make his entrance. A properly dramatic entrance that was made when his opponents were expecting a stealthy attack from behind, usually threw his opponents off balance, tipping the battle more firmly in his favor. With that in mind, he decided that dramatic entrance number 6 was best for this situation. As soon as the opportunity presented itself, he sent his sword flying across the clearing that the Hatake and his genin team were standing in to bury itself in the trunk of a tree, and leapt onto the extended handle when it had, landing with his back facing the audience. Based on the reaction of the target and the genin, his entry had been flawlessly executed. Now for the show. Tazuna discreetly checked to make sure he hadn't wet himself. He hadn't. Good. He was glad that was over. It had been a very long time since he'd last had the misfortune of witnessing a ninja battle close up. He had forgotten the sheer terror and confusion that was involved as the impossible happened right in front of one's eyes with potentially deadly results. He hadn't really understood what had been going on, and therefore wouldn't be the best witness to ask if one wanted the story of what had happened during the battle between what were obviously two legendary ninja later. They'd been walking along the road when the Uzumaki who had been reminding him of his dead cousin the entire trip why had Konoha sent him, had suddenly attacked a rabbit out of the blue, saying that it smelled like people. Considering the fact that he'd been sniffing the air like a dog while they'd been in the boat, he shouldn't have been surprised, much less doubtful that his sense of smell was that acute, but he still had been. Then, suddenly, there was a flying sword which had nearly taken his head off before it buried itself halfway into a tree. The gray-haired guy moved to confront the guy who had jumped on the sword that was now in the tree after that, and the three kids had moved to protect him. The enemy ninja, who was wearing gray button-fly pants and cow print arm and leg warmers and had his face covered in bandages, jumped onto the water and made a bunch of mist after the gray-haired man had pulled up his headband and revealed that he actually had two eyes, though the other one didn't match. Then, things got really weird, scary, and dangerous. Weapons went flying everywhere as the two men repeatedly turned into water, and then the Uzumaki suddenly multiplied and started setting traps everywhere. The black-haired boy joined the fray at this point and got injured somehow. At some other point during the battle, he found himself in the bushes while a copy of himself blew up in the enemy ninja's face. Then, the two men who'd started the fight got into some sort of jutsu contest and started making water dragons that tried to eat each other or something, and sent water flying everywhere. The battle eventually ended when a hunter nin from Kiri showed up, killed the demon guy who'd apparently gone on a homicidal rampage when he was a kid and killed the entire student body of a school, and left with the body. Afterward, the gray-haired guy collapsed, and the Uzumaki somehow made two of his clones turn into stretchers on which he placed the gray-haired guy and the black-haired boy. "You're going to get yourself killed one day if you keep leaping into danger without any forward planning, Sasuke," the Uzumaki said as two of his clones carried the stretcher towards the road. "Sometimes doing so is a good thing, since if you don't have any plans, nobody can anticipate them, but most of the time it isn't. You're damn lucky that Tatsubusa guy had just been messing around with you. You would have been dead otherwise." And with that, the battle was completely over, and they made their way to his home and the possibility of a home-cooked if somewhat meager meal, and some medical attention for the injured members of their party. Fortunately, Tsunami had picked up some top-notch first aid skills thanks to some of the more daring antics of her first husband, who had been an adrenaline junkie who had gotten himself killed in a water-skiing accident. He'd honestly expected the man to die during one of his base jumps, and had made several bets to that effect which he had lost. He hadn't been very fond of the man, but Tsunami, who had been young and head over heels in love with him, had refused to listen to his advice, and married him anyways. When the man had finally died, he'd left her alone with a newborn Inari and a mountain of debt that had forced her to move back in with him. Kaiza had been a much better son-in-law, husband, and father, even if he couldn't afford his own home and constantly mooched off of him. Sakura was torn between worry for her sensei and worry for Sasuke. Neither of the two had come away from the battle with the missing nin unscathed. Kakashi sensei was suffering from a very severe bout of chakra exhaustion, and Sasuke had a broken arm and a concussion. As he watched him sleep, Naruto had confided in her that there was a possibility that Kakashi sensei wouldn't make it through the night. If it hadn't been for Naruto's quick thinking, there was a good chance that Sasuke would be dead right now instead of merely wounded. Despite the fact that Naruto hated Sasuke and normally didn't want anything to do with him, he had risked his life to save him. When she had asked Naruto why, he'd said those who break the rules are trash. Those who abandon their teammates are worse than trash. Sasuke is my teammate, and no matter what I feel about him, I won't leave him behind. She didn't know what to think of that. Naruto hated them, and didn't want to work with them, but would risk his life to save them in a heartbeat. Would she be willing to risk her life to save someone she hated? Would she stand up to a much stronger enemy, and use herself as a distraction knowing that there was a good chance she'd die so Ino, for instance, could get away? When she was little, she'd wanted to be a ninja like those guys in the animal masks she'd sometimes seen around the village. She had joined the academy where her motive changed from becoming one of the animal mask people to impressing Ino, who had protected her from a group of bullies, and then later changed to impressing Sasuke. When she graduated, neither of them were impressed. Was this what being a ninja was? Possibly sacrificing yourself for someone you hate so the mission could be completed? Inside the village, she'd been cool, she'd been awesome, she'd been on the fast track to becoming the future Mrs. Uchiha. People had looked up to her. Outside the village, however, she'd been a minor annoyance to the enemy, a bug to be swatted, a bug that would have been swatted if her sensei and her teammates hadn't been there. Seeing that it was possible, she realized that she didn't want to be crushed or swatted. Right now, however, considering the fact that she couldn't even come close to measuring up to Sasuke, who was the second weakest member of the team, there was a distinct possibility of that happening. Naruto felt slightly worried as he watched Kakashi sleep. While there was a very good chance he'd wake up, there was also a slight possibility that instead of evening out, his breathing would slow and eventually stop. Severe cases of chakra exhaustion like the one Kakashi had were weird like that. While he was currently very, very upset with the man, Kakashi was still on his list of precious people if only just, and he didn't want him to die. Sasuke had already been seen to. Tazuna's daughter Tsunami, who was a very capable woman who apparently knew the correct way to set and splint broken arms, and deal with a concussion, had seen to that earlier. Unlike Kakashi, he had little fear that Sasuke's condition would get worse, unless the Uchiha ran off and did something stupid. All that was left for the team to do now was to rest, guard the house in case Gato had hired someone else, and wait for Kakashi to wake up. Chapter 7 Wave, Musings on Life, the Universe, and much to the relief of Naruto, who had spent the night keeping vigil at his bedside, Kakashi awoke the next morning. No matter what he felt about them at any given time, the people of Konoha were his responsibility to protect. The ninja of Konoha that he served alongside were his responsibility to bring home. And the people who truly cared about him were his precious people whom he'd do just about anything for. Having any one of them die on his watch while there was something he could have possibly done to prevent it was unacceptable. He had been very angry with Kakashi for the last several months. The man knew him, knew that he already had a sensei, and yet he still took him despite this. After apologizing for the irresponsible manner in which he had taught him Kage Bunshin 2 years ago, Kakashi had checked up on him occasionally between missions, and he would say hi to the man every time he saw him around the village, which was most often near the memorial stone which he visited to pay his respects to his mother, and the Yondaime before heading over to Yamaguchi and Fujiwara's graves to say hi. When Kakashi almost died the night before because he had overexerted himself during the battle with that missing nin from Kuri, he had been feeling scared and regretful over the fact that they would have parted under such bad terms. Kakashi was one of his precious people, and he was one of the few people who hadn't given him that cold look the first time he met him. His being completely pissed off at the man didn't change that fact. Fortunately, Kakashi had pulled through, and his breathing had stopped being shaky and evened out to a more regular pattern that indicated he was asleep sometime around midnight. He still kept watch afterward just in case, and there had been no other signs of trouble since then, and Kakashi was showing signs of waking up. As Kakashi was opening his uncovered eye, he went to fetch Sasuke and Sakura, who would undoubtedly be happy to see that their sensei had actually woken up, even if Sasuke was currently feeling rather miserable despite the painkillers he'd given him earlier. The danger had passed. Kakashi was aware and moving around, which meant that he would live, though it would take him several days to recover. Soon, the three of them were seated at the man's bedside. As team leader, Kakashi would be the one to give them orders. Shit. Kakashi groaned once he was fully aware of his surroundings. An ominous feeling came over him. That wasn't the "I did something exceedingly dangerous, and now I'm paying for it" swear. That was the crap, there's a distinct possibility that I royally screwed up swear. Not a good sign. Not a good sign at all. What? He asked, almost dreading the answer because, if Kakashi was so concerned over screwing up, something that was so beyond serious that it wasn't even funny had most likely gone wrong. That hunter nin took the body, Kakashi replied. He didn't know what the significance of this obviously significant statement was, and he didn't like not knowing. Not knowing meant that you were left out of the loop, which was a dangerous place to be if you were a ninja. As soon as he got back to Konoha, he would have to force himself to sit still long enough to read up on hunter ninja and their practices. Making sure he could read properly and know how to research any subject he needed to had been one of the best things Tetsuo Sensei had ever done for him. Hunter nin are supposed to dispose of the corpse right there, so foreign ninja can't intercept them and take the body from them in order to learn its secrets. Kakashi continued. Yeah, he was feeling like swearing too. They had let some 2-bit missing nin pull a con on them, and now they were in serious trouble because of it. That Zabuza guy was going to be coming back, and he'd be pissed as hell when he did. Ninja generally didn't like to lose, and especially didn't like being humiliated in front of a bunch of genin, or worse, in front of civilians. Zabuza had done both. Based on the technique the fake hunter nin used, and the damage Zabuza took, it will be several days before he is up and about. We've only got about a week to prepare for his next attack. Kakashi continued, summarizing his estimate of the situation. A week. Perfect. Now this was his favorite kind of fight. He would have to be careful with any of the traps he made though, as he didn't want the locals stumbling into them and getting themselves hurt. Perhaps something that would be set to only go off at the command of the setter then. Inari sat in his room staring at the picture of his father Kaiza. Unlike most times, he wasn't crying, he was thinking. Last night, shortly after grandfather had returned with the strangers, he had confronted them. Gato's too strong. If you stand up to him, you're all going to die. He yelled at the kids who were only a few years older than him, and were about to throw their lives away for nothing. If I die, then I die, but at least I go knowing I did my best to help. The blonde boy who was helping his mother fix up the dark-haired boy said. Do you think you're a hero or something? There's no such thing as heroes. He'd yelled at the boy. There weren't any heroes. Heroes only lived in fairy tales, and the idiots who thought they were heroes always got themselves killed, leaving those they left behind to try to pick up the pieces. The blonde boy had looked at him and shook his head sadly. There are heroes, the blonde boy said. In real life, however, the hero doesn't always save everyone, and sometimes the hero's only reward for his actions is to go to the afterlife knowing that he had done his best, and hoping that someone will take up his banner and succeed where he had failed. I myself would rather die trying to save everyone than watch the people around me suffer without doing anything. Had his father really been a hero rather than a fool? Had his father gone to the afterlife with the same hope? Had he let the man who had vowed to raise him despite the fact that they weren't blood down? Grandpa had picked his father's banner up when it fell when he continued construction on the bridge despite all of the threats that had been made against him, and was going to pay the ultimate price because of it. Was it worth it though? Last night he would have said that it most definitely was not, and that the way of the world was that the strong crushed the weak, and that Gato was the strong, and that anyone who went against him pointlessly wasted their lives. Now though, there was a small niggling doubt, a doubt that had been caused by the last thing the blonde boy had said as he was leaving the room. As he turned to run back to his room, the blonde boy had said evil only flourishes when good men do nothing. He had been doing nothing for a long time, and had been urging others to do nothing as well. Had he been making Gato strong because of this? Gato hadn't seemed so strong until after Dad had died and everyone was afraid to do anything about it. Sakura sat there thinking as she tended to Kakashi after Naruto had told her to make herself useful. Unlike most of the time when she had all the free time she wanted to fantasize about becoming Mrs. Uchiha, she had great deal to think about. Last night, Naruto, who had gotten fed up with her once more, had asked her why she had even wanted to be a ninja in the first place, and she had answered him honestly, though she didn't know why. Instead of laughing at her naive childishness, he'd whistled and said ANBU? That's one tough goal, you'll probably make it though. You won't catch the Hokage's attention if you keep hanging back and expecting Sasuke to rescue you, however. At this point, she wasn't sure she even wanted to become an ANBU, much less if she still wanted to be a ninja. As she was now, she was weak and could easily be killed if there was no one to jump in and do her fighting for her. But Naruto had honestly seemed to believe that she could become one of the village's most elite ninja who were hand-selected by the Hokage to serve him someday if she worked hard at it. He'd even gone so far as to lay out a plan for her to be able to reach her goal. Strange, it wasn't until then that she'd realized that she didn't have any goals in life other than to become Mrs. Uchiha. What came after she attained that goal? Babies? And what else? What would she do to fill her time when Sasuke was out on missions? What would she do if Sasuke died on one? What would there be after Sasuke? Becoming an ANBU and life after Sasuke weren't the only things she had to think about, though. She hadn't known if it was stupidity or courage that had made her do so, but she had asked Naruto why he had killed those two genin from IWA. He told her. It hadn't been because they had blocked his promotion, as she'd spent the last several months believing. If she'd seen two of her classmates, or even any two ninjas she'd met, say, the week before, be killed in front of her, would she do what Naruto had done? Would she lose it so completely that she wouldn't even realize that the people responsible for killing her comrades were dead until long after their broken and bleeding bodies had fallen to the ground? She had heard so many times that the life of a ninja was one that was filled with pain and death while she was in the academy, but she truly hadn't begun to realize what that had meant until now. It was too late to turn back, however. She'd signed a 5-year service agreement when she had earned her spot on the team, instead of the 1-year provisional agreement that had been recommended. The only way she could get out now is if they kicked her out, and ninja who got kicked out were held in contempt in Konoha. If she were dismissed, she would have to move and leave everything she knew behind if she didn't want to live as an outcast. Sasuke too was thinking, despite the headache from the concussion, but it wasn't about his goals and ambitions. He'd asked Kakashi where he'd gotten his Sharingan eye, and the man had refused to answer. An expression that looked like a cross between guilt and grief crossed what little he could see of the man's face before he turned his back to him and dismissed him. Certain that he would know, considering the fact that he seemed to know any number of things he shouldn't, he'd then gone to that boy for the answers Kakashi had refused to give him. That boy had indeed known as he'd suspected he would. "I heard what everyone knows from Tetsuo-sensei," that boy said. Back during the war, Kakashi was on a team with an Uchiha named Obito. Something went seriously wrong during a mission, and Kakashi came back with the eye, a missing teammate, even more issues than he'd left with, and a new habit that had caused Obito time to be renamed Kakashi time. Since the clan had been alive at the time and would have demanded the man's head on a plate if that had been what happened, he knew that Kakashi hadn't stolen his teammate's eye. The answer to how he'd gotten it then was that Obito had given it to him. Why would Obito have done something like that? Why would he give one of his eyes, knowing that he risked never finding the right path on his journey through the afterlife? Kakashi had not even been blood, he'd just been a teammate. Kakashi struggled to sit up. It was a difficult task, however. He was tired and his muscles refused to cooperate. He needed to get up quickly, though. He needed to start training his students for the coming confrontation as soon as possible, which would be just as soon as he could stand with or without assistance. He knew what he needed to start them on, since he wouldn't be able to use his chakra or move around all that much for a while, and frankly he should have started it weeks ago, considering the benefits the exercise held for the uninitiated, instead of wasting his time on completely pointless teamwork exercises. Naruto pretty much had this skill mastered already, so he would have to find something else for the boy to do. He did have a bit of spare testing paper on him that he'd won in a bet. Maybe he would start training the boy to harness his chakra affinity so he could more easily master elemental jutsu. He knew that the boy already had a couple wind jutsu in his arsenal, and they could become even more powerful where he trained. With that plan in mind, he lay back down. While it was a good thing to exert oneself, overdoing it was detrimental to one's well-being. As he lay there, he speculated on what Minato-sensei's son's elemental affinity would be. Would it be wine like his father, as the boy's small arsenal of elemental jutsu indicated, or would it be water like his mother? The boy looked like both parents and took after both parents, though he favored his mother in looks and behavior somewhat, as that odd verbal tick indicated so. It would be interesting to find out which one he favored in that area. Unfortunately, even if Naruto possessed the ability, he had absolutely no idea as to how one would go about teaching the boy how to create the chakra chains that his mother had been able to create, which was a pity since Naruto could have used them to hold their opponent down while he beat him up. That's it for part 3. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.